uh, uh, पिछला वाला part कि उसके अंदर what we were doing was कि there was this IUPAC nomenclature which was, I told you, it is very detailed. It has a lot of rules, and since you're not studying a lot of organic compounds, they're not in your course, so not all of it actually applies to you. Uh, Plus, you don't have to remember so many rules. I'm going to keep things a bit simpler. Uh, ये methods prop but ठीक है, this is already you're aware of. This is the prefix, and the suffix is, if it's an alkane, it's ane. I told you about general formulas that they mostly don't work. ठीक है, in most cases they don't work. They only work for very simple straight chain molecules. अच्छा, but anyways, we were at alkenes. Alkenes had a double bond functional group, and uh, the naming was exactly the same except for the suffix being "ene." And the other thing about this was the position of the double bond has to be mentioned. And I told you that the double bond position is counted from the side that gives the smaller number. So this one is but-1-ene. So you have two options. You can count from the left, or you can count from the right. You can count from both sides. Okay, so just a second, there's something wrong. So you could count from the left, you could count from the right side. But you're going to choose that side that gives the smaller number, okay, right? So if you start counting from the right, the double bond is on the third carbon atom, okay? And if you count from the left, the double bond is at the first carbon atom, which is why you're going to call it but-1-ene. And this one would be but-2-ene. In this case, it doesn't really matter which side you count it from. Uh, it would always be but-2-ene. This one would be, you're going to count from this side. This one would be prop-1-ene. And even if the double bond is on the right side, it would still remain prop-1-ene because it would just be a flipped around version. So then another thing about alkenes. What if you have multiple double bonds? What would you do then? So if a molecule has multiple double bonds, now how would you try and name that molecule? Uh, so this time let's draw a molecule of let's say there's a pent. This is 5 carbon atoms, so that's pent. There's a double bond in the first carbon atom, and there's another double bond on the third carbon atom. And all of the this is 3 hydrogens. This one would have 1 hydrogen. This one would have one hydrogen, and this one would have 2 hydrogens. Now this molecule would be pent and ene. So it is pentene. That's the functional groups. That's prefix and suffix. In the middle, you have to mention the position. Now you can clearly see that you're going to count from the side that gives the smaller number to both double bonds. So from this side, this one would be number 1 and this one would be number 3. So one of the double bond is at 1 and the other one is at number 3. If you count it from the other side, then the positions are going to be 2 and 4. So those are bigger numbers. So you count from the left side. So you write both positions. It's pent 1 and 3, and you're going to add di to it. Di means that you have two double bonds. Uh, and this is always what you're going to do. That if you have multiple functional groups, if there were 3 double bonds, then this would have been tri. And you would have mentioned the position of all 3 of them. So this is your position. And this represents the number of carbon-carbon double bonds. Okay? Is this clear? Bazga clear? Minahil, is this clear? Is that clear?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
And the same rule would apply to pretty much all other functional groups as well. Okay, it's going to be molecules are going to be named the same way. Prefix, suffix, and in the middle, the position of the double bonds or the whatever the functional group is, and this is the quantity. This is the quantity of the functional groups. So this is alkenes. Let's move to the next one. The next one is let's talk about alcohols. Now, alcohols have OH as a functional group. that's your functional group. Just wait one second. Let me add. Achha, OH is the functional group, and you can have one OH. You can have multiple OHs. The general formula is this one, which usually doesn't work. Especially doesn't work if there are too many OH groups. Um, and let's draw a simple alcohol. You have two carbon atoms. There's an OH. Okay, now things. Now you've studied alkanes. You've studied alkenes. Things would get slightly more complicated. Uh, so you have OH. This is clearly eth because it has two carbon atoms. That's your prefix. Uh, the suffix for an alcohol is all, but it's not just going to be all. There's going to be an an and then an all. Okay, so eth tells you the number of carbon atoms. Okay, that's the number of carbon atoms. All indicates that there is OH group. Okay, it indicates there's going to be an alcohol group. Okay, so there is an OH group. What does En over here represent? Okay, I mean, you've studied this previously as well, but no one actually, uh, it was never discussed what this En stood for. Okay, why isn't it ethyl? Why is there an An over there? So the An has a role as well. The An tells you whether the molecule is saturated or it's unsaturated. I mean, it tells you that the carbon and carbon bonds are the single bonds, or are the carbon and carbon they're forming a double bond. Okay, so you could have a saturated alcohol with all carbons, every bond being a single bond, or you could have an unsaturated alcohol where you could have double bonds as well. If all are single bonds, then it's An. If there's a double bond, it's going to be En. So this molecule could be, I mean, this one is ethanol. Okay, this one is clearly ethanol because it's saturated. But if you had a similar molecule and instead the double bond had, there was a double bond between the carbon atoms. Now again, it's two carbon atoms. That's eth. There's an alcohol. That's OL, OH. That's all. And instead of the an, there's going to be en because it is saturated. Uh, so just remember that this an and en, this thing would matter, and it would matter everywhere because you have lots of big molecules. Some have double bonds, some don't have double bonds. Some are saturated, some are unsaturated. Uh, so from now on, uh, this part would actually be important, whether you're going to call it an an or would you call it an en. Okay, is this clear to everyone? Ibrahim, is this clear? Abba, is this clear?
Yes, sir.
And obviously with each one, you're going to write the position. Now OH is at position number 1, so you're going to write position of the wall of the OH group, and AN doesn't have a position. It just means it's all saturated, so that really doesn't have a position. So on the other hand, over here, OH is at position number 1, and EN represents the double bond. That is also, I mean, you're going to count from this side so that both of them get smaller numbers. So this would also be 1. So it's going to be, I mean, the proper name would be eth1 en1 all. Okay, you have to mention the position.
Sir,
Yes.
sir, over here we can actually count from both of the sides. Matlab, counting carbon from double bonds from both of the side will give us one in.
Nahi, I said, remember one thing, you're only allowed to count from one side. Okay, you have to choose one side, and all groups have to be counted from that side. Okay. But
Sir, okay.
let me clarify that counting is done from the side that all groups get smaller numbers.
Okay.
Okay, so
Sorry.
हर दफा ना you're not going to change the side. KG for counting double
Alright.
bond, you're counting from left, and for OH. So counting is done from the side.
Sorry. Okay. Yeah, I get it.
That overall gives smaller number to the groups. लेकिन इसके ऊपर भी अभी we'll talk about this in a bit more detail later on. ठीक है? Overall gives smaller number to all groups. ठीक है? Right now ये भी याद रखा, we're just talking about simpler molecules, so I'm not discussing counting that much yet. अभी branches आएंगी, lots of then we're going to move towards multiple functional groups, so things would get even more complicated. For counting, then we're going to talk about counting. Which side would you count from? ठीक है? लेकिन अभी फिलहाल just remember, counting is done from the side that overall is going to give you a smaller number. ठीक है? अच्छा खैर, one is usually not written. ठीक है? Because one is the default position. Plus this molecule, it cannot have a 2. I mean, this molecule also cannot have a 2. I mean, if OH is on the other side, it would still be 1. So remember this, if nothing is written, the position is not mentioned, then it's by default it's 1. Okay. So let's do another molecule. Okay, I'm going to stick with saturated alcohols first. So let's do another example. I have 4 carbon atoms. There's an OH over here. And so this is the alcohol. Can anyone name? Can anyone tell me what the name is? 4 carbon atom. What would it start with?
Butane.
Butanol.
Bute.
Okay. Bute saturated. So that's
Yeah.
AN, and it is butanol. But what are the positions?
2.
So yeah.
Okay, so this one is at position number 2. It's on the second carbon atom. Okay, from you're going to count from this side. This is 1. This is 2. So it's
Okay.
or AN की obviously कोई position नहीं. It just means it's a saturated alcohol. Acha, what if you have this molecule? You have OH and you have a double bond over here. Okay, so you have a double bond over here, and this would have 2 hydrogens. This would have 1 hydrogen, 3 bonds. So 1 hydrogen. This would have 3 hydrogens. What would be the name of this molecule?
Bute. Bute 2.
नहीं, पहले तो सारे वो लिख लो. पहले तो bute, all, and
Bute.
AN or EN?
Bute 2.
EN.
EN.
ठीक है. Now talk
Exactly.
now talk about the position. OL. Where's the all?
Oh, it's actually on the first position. 1.
ठीक है. It's on the first position. It's 1.
Yeah.
And where's the double bond?
3.
2. 2.
This is the side you're counting from. This is
2.
1. This is 2. So it's going to be bute 2 in 1 all. ठीक है. Is this clear? Minhail clear? Rida, Hiba, is this clear? Abba clear?
Yes.
Yes.
Acha, so now what if you have multiple functional groups? Acha, remember, naming can be very complicated. Like direct questions on naming are very few, and they're just for 1 or 2 marks. Like the whole question might depend on the naming. I mean, if you can't figure out what the molecule is, they give you a name of a molecule. Acha, and remember, you have to learn how to practice both ways. Like if the name is given, you have to figure out the structure. If the structure is given, you have to figure out the name. Okay? Both ways are kind of different, because the name is given, people get confused. They can't figure out the structure. They might learn how to name a structure, not the other way around. Okay? So we're going to practice both ways. Okay? So multiple function groups, multiple OHs, not functional groups. So I have this molecule. I have a molecule of there's an OH here, and there's an OH over here, and there's a double bond at this position. But let's make it. So this would be 3 hydrogens. This would have 1 hydrogen. This has 4 bonds. This would have 2 hydrogens. So what would be the name of the molecule? First thing, prefix. What's the prefix? Number of carbon atoms.
Bute.
Okay, so this is bute, and it's obviously an alcohol, so all. And would it be AN or EN in the middle?
EN.
EN.
Okay, अब बताओ कि so since how many alls do you have? How many OHs do you have?
2.
So it's a diol, okay? It's a diol. And what are the positions of the OH groups? You're going to count from the side that gives the smaller number. So what are the positions?
1 and 2.
1 and 2. So it's going to be 1, comma 2. You have to mention the position of both alls. Okay? Achha, then move to then move to EN.
2.
What position is EN at? Double bond.
2.
Okay? That's at 2. So this is your molecule of, this is the name of this molecule. Butene 1,2-diol. Clear है सारों को? Everyone else, is this clear? So it's kind of difficult. Just follow this rule. Prefix, suffix, ठीक है? And the middle part is AN. ठीक है? That's whether it has double bonds or it doesn't have double bonds. ठीक है? And then followed up by the positioning. If there are multiple functional groups, I said let's try another molecule. Let's move to 5 carbon atoms. Just one more. Okay, let's move to 5 carbon atoms and double bonds. And there's an OH here. There's an OH here. This will have 1 hydrogen. This will have 3 bonds. So that's 1 hydrogen, 3 bonds, 1 hydrogen, 1 bond. So there would be 3 hydrogens, right? I just starting prefix. What's the prefix?
Pent.
Okay, number of carbon atoms, that's 5, pent. AN or EN?
EN.
EN.
Okay, EN, and it's obviously the suffix is all. It's an alcohol. Okay. Achha, the next thing is, how many OHs do you have? You have 2, right?
Yeah, exactly.
बल्कि एक और let's ठीक है, just keep it at 2. So it's a diol, right? What is the position of the 2 alcohols?
1.
1 diol.
You have to mention the position of both alcohols. So it's going to be 1, 1. Get it?
Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, exactly.
ठीक है? Just don't write 1 once. But you have 2 alcohols. You have to mention, even the position is the same. You have to mention it twice. ठीक है?
All right.
Achha, how many ENs do you have? EN is alkene, a double bond.
2.
ठीक है? So you have, so it's a diene.
1 and 3 and
it's 1 and
Oh, acha. Yeah, I get.
ठीक है? It's 1 and 3. So this is first carbon atom, then second, third carbon atom, where there's another double bond. Okay. Clear to the rest? Mirail, is this clear? Abba, clear? Rida, Hiba, is this clear?
Yes.
Achha, so plus one very tiny thing about this one, very about naming, like I'm adding commas and I'm adding dashes. Okay. So what's the rule of adding commas? Why don't I have a dash between the 1 and 1? So the rule is, it's a simple rule, and that is number and number. Like if you're naming something and there are 2 numbers coming together, they're going to have a comma between them. If there's a number next to a letter, then there's going to be a dash. And if there are 2 letters, not letters, I think they should be alphabets. Letter is probably not the right word. So if there's a number next to an alphabet, then there has to be a dash between them. An alphabet next to an alphabet, uh, they should be together. There shouldn't be any space. Although I'm probably uh, there shouldn't be any space between alphabets. Like P, E, and T, they should be together. There shouldn't be any spaces. Nothing coming in between them. Die and een, that should be together. Die and all, that should be together. No spaces. But whenever you see a number and a alphabet, then there has to be a dash put in between them. And if there's a number followed by another number, then there has to be a comma between them. Okay? Is this rule clear?
Yes, and if it's alphabet and then number, there's also a dash.
Alphabet, number, alphabet, always going to be a dash between them. Okay? The same thing is
Understood.
the same thing is happening over here as well. Okay, number, both sides there's alphabet, so there's going to be a dash. But if you have two numbers together, then there's going to be a comma between them. And if there's letter, die, and all, no spaces. Okay, they should just be put together. Okay, clear है बाकियों को? Is this clear to everyone? This thing.
Yes.
अच्छा, so let's move on. Same thing. Okay, the same thing would just keep on repeating. The next functional group that we're going to talk about, we're talking about alcohols. Exactly same thing would happen to the other ones as well. Okay, the same rules would apply, except that the suffix would be different. Every time, the only difference would be that the name is going to end differently. That's the only difference. Okay, so if it's an alcohol, if it's going to be a carboxylic acid, then it's going to end differently. As anyways, moving on to the next one. There's a new organic compound which is known as carbonyl compounds. Now, carbonyl compounds are compounds that have C double bond O in them. Okay, it's a new functional group. Okay, which is why I'm going to explain this a bit in a bit more detail. But only remember, the carbonyl compounds that only have C double bond O. This is known as a carbonyl group. I said, and just to clarify, like this is a carboxylic acid, if you remember this. This is not a carbonyl compound. I mean, it just has to be C double bond O. That's it. Okay, this is not carbonyl. Or even, so let me just make it clear that carbonyl compounds are C double bond O with alkyl chain on both sides. Alkyl chain or slash hydrogens only. Nothing else. Okay, this one is not carbonyl. You have other functional groups that are not carbonyl. For example, you had esters. TK, if you remember, this is an ester. It's not a carbonyl group. You have amides. TK, like polypeptides, etc. They have this thing. If you take bio, you probably have studied this as well this year. So these are not carbonyl. Remember that. Okay, when you talk about carbonyl groups, it's only going to be C double bond O. So the example is like you have carbons and there's a C double bond O somewhere. Okay, and this is going to have 3 hydrogens. This is going to have 2 hydrogens. This is going to have 3 hydrogens. So this is a carbonyl compound. And similarly, one more example. Let's say this is also carbonyl. Okay, actually, it has 2 carbonyl groups. There's a carbonyl group on the right side and there's a carbonyl group on the left side. So these are the examples of carbonyl compounds. Okay, is this clear? Okay, what are carbonyl compounds? Make sure you know that these are not carbonyl compounds. Okay, it's just going to have C double bond O. That's about it. ठीक है, clear है सारों को?
Yes, sir.
Sir,
Yes.
sir, you said basically on both sides of a carbonyl compound you will have a alkyl chain or hydrogens only.
Yeah. ठीक है.
On the right side of C double bond O, on starting from the left,
This one?
below this. No, below this.
हाँ.
Yeah, this. So basically there's CH2, which is not an alkyl chain.
नहीं, it is an alkyl chain. But an alkyl chain is a carbon chain, that's it. I mean, it is a carbon chain. But तुम इससे confused हो रहे हो ना?
But
What you
matlab,
think is कि you've been taught that this is a alkyl chain, right?
exactly, yeah.
ठीक है, but like I told you, general formulas don't work. ठीक है, they don't work most of the time. Alkyl chain is simply a carbon chain. ठीक है, if you have a bunch of carbon atoms with hydrogens around it.
Sir, so but then
हाँ.
But then how do we differentiate? Then how do we differentiate between an alkyl group from a alkane group and from an alkene group?
नहीं, देखो, the word alkyl, ठीक है, the word alkyl है ना, that's referred to any, it's a general word. ठीक है, उस पे मैं बाद में आता हूँ. We haven't done branches yet. The word, so I'm just going to be brief. Alkyl is simply a carbon chain, a carbon and hydrogen chain.
All right.
Whether it is saturated or whether it's unsaturated, we don't really care. I mean, alkanes, if you look at an alkane, it is basically an alkyl chain. ठीक है? An alkene on its own, that's basically an alkyl chain as well. ठीक है, वो branches के अंदर आते हैं. मतलब you don't use the word alkyl for them, but if they are branches of another molecule, then you refer to them as alkyl chains. ठीक है?
Okay.
अच्छा, so
ठीक है.
तो अभी फिलहाल we're not discussing alkyl chains yet, क्योंकि we're not talking about branched molecules yet. What you just need to know is that whenever I refer to the word alkyl chain, it's just a carbon and hydrogen chain. ठीक है? I mean, most organic molecules are pretty much carbon and hydrogen atoms bonded together with some functional groups in between. Anyways, these are aldehydes. These are carbonyl compounds. Now, carbonyl compounds are further divided into two things. पहले मैं इसको highlight कर लेता हूँ कि this is what your carbonyl group. This is what your carbonyl group is. These are carbonyl groups. Now, carbonyl is further divided into two things. One is two different functional groups. One of them is called an aldehyde. The other one is called a ketone. Okay, so aldehyde and ketones. What's an aldehyde? So aldehyde is when the C double bond O is right at the end. I mean, right at the end, so there's going to be H. R is going to be referred to as so this one. Now also remember, I'm going to be using R very frequently. R just represents the rest of the molecule. In this case, usually it represents the carbon chain. So there's going to be carbon chain on one side, and that is where the aldehyde group or the carbonyl group is going to be right at the end. As an example, if you look at this molecule, this is an aldehyde. The C double bond O is right at the end. Okay, so whenever you see C double bond O right at the end of the chain, that is what an aldehyde is. And the other one is a ketone. Okay, the ketone is obviously a carbonyl group which is right in the middle. So you would have C double bond O, and on both sides there's going to be carbon chains, alkyl chains on both sides. One example is like you have this molecule, and one example is you have this molecule. There's a double bond O, So this is a double bond O, 3 hydrogens, 2 hydrogens, and this would have 3 hydrogens. So this is your ketone. So you have aldehyde and you have ketones. Very, very similar. One has double bond O at the end, the other one has double bond O somewhere in the middle of the chain. ठीक है ये सारों को clear? Is this clear? Rida, Hibab, Aba, is this clear?
Yes.
Is there the word ketone will be used when the carbonyl group is in the beginning as well?
नहीं, if it's in the beginning, तो वो end ही हो गया ना. I mean, this is also, let me,
Oh, yeah, it will be a flip version. Okay, yes.
ठीक है मतलब
Understood.
मतलब मैं उसके साथ ही just for clarity I'm just going to do an example कि even if the double bond O is at the beginning and this is 3 hydrogens, that's still an aldehyde, ठीक है. So मतलब on either side, right, left, remember right, left doesn't really matter, ठीक है. उसी molecule को you pick it up, put it upside down, so the thing that is at the right would then appear to be on the left side, ठीक है. अच्छा, so carbonyl compounds, aldehydes and ketones. Now, starting with the naming of aldehydes. अच्छा, aldehydes के अंदर position is not an issue. Why is it not an issue? Because it's always at the end. So aldehydes. The suffix for an aldehyde is al. ठीक है, I mean, alcohol was OL, aldehyde is Al. So let's say you have this molecule. So now by default, position is not an issue. This would be always 1. ठीक है, always position number 1. But even if it's on the other side, it's still going to be position number 1. ठीक है, that's where you're going to start counting from. You have to give the aldehyde the smaller number. ठीक है, so it's always going to be position 1. तो यहाँ पे ना वो वाला issue नहीं है कि you have to number it. So this one is going to be prop. AN and AL. ठीक है, the AN and EN thing would still be there because that information is just there to tell you whether the molecule is saturated or unsaturated, whether they are double bonds or not. So this is propanol. No need to mention any position because it's by default it's always 1. ठीक है, ये clear है सारों को by default? Minal, is this clear? Baza, clear है?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
So the by default it's always 1. तो mention करने का फायदा क्या है? There's no point in mentioning it. Similarly, if you have another molecule of let's say this molecule, it's an aldehyde as well. This would have 1H, this would have 2 hydrogens. Now this molecule. Now this one would be but, AN, AL, ठीक है? It is butanol. No point in mentioning the position of the aldehyde group. It's always number 1. This is where you're going to count from. Wait,
Is it an A? The double bond.
ठीक है, exactly. It was an EN. It was an EN. ठीक है, there's a double bond. It's unsaturated. अच्छा, what's the position of the EN? I mean, if you're always giving it position number 1, so this is 2 and this is?
3.
So it's but 3, EN and AL. वो spaces नहीं होती, you can put them together, ठीक है? Is this clear? Aldehydes.
Yes.
ठीक है, Aba, Rida, Eba, is this clear? Ibrar, clear है?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
और एक आध ना we can do one with multiple functional groups. Just ठीक है, that was one thing that was mentioned. How can you have multiple functional groups in an aldehyde? ठीक है, the way you can have multiple functional groups is कि you have, let's say, So let's say you have this molecule, there's a double bond O and H over here, and the double bond O and H.
Should I just have a question with the
Yes.
above molecule?
हाँ.
Sir, उसमें why don't we count from the left hand side instead of counting from the right hand side?
उस पे मैं आता हूँ.
Where we,
अभी तो I've told you that it's always position number one. Whenever you have an aldehyde, it's
uh,
always position number one. So you have to. I mean, you're stuck. This is position number one, so you have to count from this side.
so अच्छा alright सही.
ठीक है. अच्छा अभी लेकिन what we haven't studied yet is कि counting के ना there's some more rules which we're going to study later. One of them is कि not all functional groups are as important. ठीक है. For example, I mean double bond has the least importance. So when you're counting, you have to give the smaller number to the most important group in the molecule. ठीक है. Do you get my point? So like in this case, you have a double bond over here, and you have an alkene group over here. So abhi hum, like a little further down the line, we're going to study that when you're counting, you give the smaller number to the group that has the highest precedence. So, right after this, we're going to study multiple functional groups. Like a molecule can have an alkene, it could have an aldehyde, it could also be a ketone at the same time, it could also be an alcohol at the same time. So if a molecule has lots of functional groups, so how do you name that molecule? Like if it's an alcohol, if it's an alkene, if it's a aldehyde, if it's lots of things. So what would you call that molecule? ठीक है. तो उसमें फिर हम आगे जाके ना what we're going to study is that not all functional groups are equally important. There are some that are more important. So the naming is based on them and the counting is based on them. ठीक है. Ibrahim, do you get my point?
Yes sir.
ठीक है. Right now, just remember, okay, whenever you have a double bond O, so you're supposed to give that the smaller number. ठीक है. अच्छा उसके बाद माइक ऑफ कर लो प्लीज. अच्छा now after this one, let me complete this one. This is the only one that we would be able to complete now. This will have two hydrogens. ठीक है. अच्छा this is the molecule. So it's how many carbon atoms? That's 5. 5 is pent. अच्छा AN or EN? It's going to be EN and al. ठीक है. That's AL. Now there are two aldehydes. Okay, there's an aldehyde over here and there's an aldehyde over here on both sides. So it is dial. Okay. Now it's up to you. You can mention the position. Uh, One of them is at number 1 and the other one would be at number 5. But for aldehydes, that's your choice. Okay, because even if you don't mention the position, if there are two aldehydes, then the chain has two ends. One would be at the one side, the other one would be at the other side. So by default, you would still know the position. So it's not important to actually tell the position of the aldehyde group. Okay, मतलब it's by default you know that it's going to be at the end. And if there are two aldehydes, then one would be over here, the other one would obviously be on the other side. So this 1,5 is not really required. And the EN would be, it's on the second one, okay, from the left. So it's spent 2-en 1,5 dial. And the 1,5 is not really necessary. Even if you don't mention it, the naming is still fine.
If we started counting it from the right,
मतलब पीछे numbering क्या रह जाती है कि the only thing that's left is you have to give the double bond the smaller number, right? क्योंकि
yeah, okay.
for aldehydes it doesn't really matter. You count from this side, this is 1, this is 5. You count from this side, this would still be 1, this would still be 5. ठीक है. So the smaller number wala part that's only left up to the double bond. Okay, so it's going to be pen 2-en 1,5 dial, and 1,5 is not really needed. Clear है सारों को? Hiba, is this Rida, is this clear? Minail, Abba, is this clear?
Yes.
अच्छा चलो ठीक है.
Yeah.
चलो ठीक है. So we'll continue with this. Try and revise this. Make sure this is on your fingertips. ठीक है. it's very important. I mean, this systematic naming. It's pretty much the same. Okay, for all the molecules except the suffix is changing. That's pretty much it. Baki the rules are pretty much. I mean, they're quite the same. So ठीक है, we'll continue with this in the next class then. Okay. Okay then.
Allah Hafiz.
Take care, Allah Hafiz.